In late August 1900, two fashionable Pensacola ladies bought 2 round-trip tickets to Galveston, Texas to visit family members. They arrived at the L&N depot on East Wright Street, where 2 porters transported their luggage to the appropriate rail car. When the standard call of "all aboard" was heard, they jacked up their long skirts and climbed aboard the passenger car. Soon, they could feel the steam engine begin to pull the cars down the tracks to the tune of a rhythmic chugging as it gathered speed. This movement was accompanied by the hissing of the steam escaping from the valves, together with the clanking of metal against metal. The train's steam whistle had its own unique sound, still recognizable today. They both looked forward to this great adventure on the Texas Gulf Coast, but little did they know the horror they would encounter and barely survive. The 2 ladies were Mary Matilda Nicholson Lovelace and her sister Dora A. Nicholson Stewart. They were the daughters of a farmer, Angus William Nicholson, and his wife Frances Fannie Lucinda Williams. Their destination was Galveston, where their widowed cousin Lily Zorelda Golay Garrett was living. Lily's mother, Sarah Ann Rebecca Williams, was the sister of Mary and Dora's mother Fannie. Lily had married George Owen Garrett in Butler County, Alabama, in 1865, right after he returned from the war. George had been a member of Company H of the 15th Confederate Cavalry in Mobile, Alabama. By 1880, she and George had moved to Robertson County, Texas, where they lived with his parents Charles C. and Louisa Owen Garrett. By 1888, George had been a machinist in Dallas, prior to his death sometime before 1897. After George's death, Lily supported herself as a matron for the Sheltering Arms Home and Hospital for Women and Children, an initiative of the Christ Episcopal Church in Houston. Records show that she was working there prior to 1897 and was a widow at the time. But somewhere along the way, she married the good Reverend Peter Edward Nicholson in April 1900 and moved into his house on Clear Lake in the community of Seabrook on Galveston Bay. Toward the end of his life, Peter had already acquired 300 acres of land on Galveston Bay. He would later sell it to the Seabrook Land Corporation, where the town of Seabrook is located today. However, his roots were in Pensacola, Florida, where his parents had moved in 1830. Eventually, he became a preacher and held services in the home of Daniel Shepherd, a well-known settler in Escambia County. He would move to Texas in 1857, where he began a long life of preaching. And it was to Seabrook where Mary and Dora were heading to see Cousin Lily and her new husband. Mary Matilda had been a widow since 1885, when her husband James Clark Lovelace had passed away. Mary had been his second wife after their marriage prior to 1880. James had been a Confederate soldier in Company H of the 14th Virginia Infantry Regiment and became a carpenter after the war. Her sister Dora, on the other hand, would marry Charles A. Stewart, who was a ship's carpenter most of his life, and they would spend most of that time living at 501 Haynes Street in Pensacola. Upon arrival, Mary and Dora set about catching up on all the news from Lily and Peter, and vice versa from the 2 sisters about the goings-on in Pensacola. One item was the sisters' mother Rebecca, who was still alive and was living with her 2 grown children at 402 West Garden Street. But in the middle of their wonderful visit, the ladies began hearing talk on September 4th of a tropical disturbance moving over Cuba, but that was still a long way away. The Weather Office was even discouraging using terms like hurricane in the news to avoid causing panic among the populace. The U.S. Weather Director even went so far as to block all weather reports coming out of Cuba because of the recent Spanish-American War, even though their system was the best in the world at the time. The forecasters projected the storm would turn north along the eastern seaboard, however they would soon change, to include the Pensacola to New Orleans coast. The Cuban forecasters kept insisting it was not heading northeast, but westward instead. On September 7th, the seas were mounting higher, albeit still under a partly cloudy sky. But since the weather was still pleasurable, no one saw the need for concern and few, if any, evacuated Galveston. However, by mid-morning, rain clouds began to darken, but again few took any real notice. But quickly the weather began to deteriorate, as high winds began taking down the telegraph lines between Jacksonville and Pensacola, with Pass Christian recording winds of 58 miles per hour, driving the Gulf waters inland, destroying railroad tracks and sinking ships. After causing great damage in Louisiana, the storm reached Galveston early in the morning of September 8. A 15-foot storm surge washed completely over Galveston Island and rose swiftly from 3 p.m. until 7:30 p.m. By 8:30 p.m., 5 more feet had further inundated the city. To make matters worse, the winds had increased to 100 sustained miles per hour and may have been faster, but their anemometer was blown off the building, putting an end to any further measurement. During the storm, the Catholic St. Mary's Orphanage was selected as the safest refuge for the 10 nuns and 93 children. It was located on the beachfront behind a line of sand dunes. As the waves mounted higher and higher, the sisters decided to move the children over to the girls' dormitory because it was newer and better built. But then the situation turned from bad to worse as the children became more terrified. So the nuns had them sing Queen of the Waves to calm them down. Soon, the sand dunes near the beach were swept away, leaving them nothing to impede the raging waters. By this time, the boys' dorm was demolished and was now gone. At 7:30 p.m., the tidal surge was at its highest and most destructive as homes and buildings everywhere just disappeared. As the water level rose, many of them ran up to the second story to save themselves from the waves. This is when they began seeing people being washed past them and pulled those they could reach onto the second-story balcony. Three of the boys climbed up onto the roof in hopes of surviving. As the sisters realized that their building was doomed, they cut up their clothesline and tied the children to each of the 10 nuns in a desperate attempt to save them. Before long, the first story of the dorm collapsed, causing the second story to crash down and crush all those below. The surviving nuns and children were swept away into their water, where their fate was already sealed. Their courageous effort to save the children was futile. When the building finally collapsed, all of them went into the broiling seas, where all perished except for the 3 older boys on the roof. The bodies of 2 of the nuns were found still tied to the children, and all were buried where they were found. And it was at Lily's house near Seabrook that Dora and Mary sat down to eat supper around 7:30 p.m. Sadly, this was the same time that the gigantic storm surge arrived. Like so many homes around them, huge waves struck the Nicholson house and knocked it off its foundation. The windows were smashed inwards and the 3 women were driven off their feet and into the opposite wall. Completely engulfed in the water, they swam upwards to get to air, then looked around for something to hold on to. Since Dora was closest, she swam to an open door and made her way up the stairs to the second floor. Mary was able to grab the floating dining room table and used it to get out the same door. But Lily had been on the opposite side of the dining table, therefore the farthest from the door leading upstairs. The best she could do was grab a hold of a side table where the food had been placed. However, the water was rushing in so fast that she and the table were being rocketed upwards into the ceiling. The last anyone saw of her alive was on top of that small table. The next day, Lily was found hanging from the broken first-story window by her long hair. Since the door used by Dora and Mary was then underwater, most believed that she had slid off the table and tried to swim underwater to get out of the closest window, and her hair became entangled and she drowned. Don't forget that women's dresses at the time were ankle length, and their hair was grown long, so both would have been a further hindrance under the circumstances. Although some say her body was never recovered, the article says otherwise. In the meantime, Dora and Mary were trapped in the attic with no way out. The house had been knocked off its foundation, but was still fairly intact. But the water was rising rapidly, and they were terrified they would drown before they could find an exit. Determined to survive, Dora began tearing a hole through the roof's wooden shingles to the point her hands and fingernails were bloody. Finally, there was a hole big enough for both to crawl out onto the roof, where they spent the night subjected to the raging winds and the torrential rain. But at least they lived to return home. But surviving the storm was one thing, surviving the aftermath was another. All the food, for the most part, had been destroyed, and there was no drinkable water anywhere to be found. Bodies were everywhere, and as they rotted, the flies arrived in the thousands. Unfortunately, help was still a long way off. But, at some point in time, Dora was able to get word to her husband Charles back home in Pensacola as to what had happened. There is no record how or how long it took for Dora and Mary to get back home, but return they did to their loving families. As for Lily, she likely was buried quickly in an unmarked mass grave along with the thousands of others. The 1900 Galveston hurricane was labeled as the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people would perish, which represented approximately 1/6 of the Galveston population. Most of these deaths were brought about by the tremendous storm surge that would also destroy over 7,000 buildings and 3,700 homes. At least 10,000 survivors were left homeless. The final readings registered the storm as a Category 4 with a maximum sustained wind of 145 miles per hour, making landfall on September 8. Damage from the storm across America would exceed $34 million. Given the amount of damage, one is awestruck to think that most of the hurricane's damage in the United States occurred in Texas, especially around the Galveston area. As far out as 6 miles, the prairie around Galveston was covered with debris and rotting bodies. People on an incoming supply train counted over 200 bodies laying about. Many of the dead were from the gigantic storm surge that swept over Galveston like a freight train. As the weather cleared, the corpses began to decompose to the point that the stench could be smelled for miles. For those that tried to leave the city, they found all the bridges washed away along with 15 miles of train tracks. Like most storms even today, the survivors found all electrical lines and telegraph wires down. Adding to the infrastructure damage, every single public building was damaged or destroyed. The hospital, city gas works, city water department, and their customs house and post office was damaged as well. For those that turned to their religion for solace, it should be noted that of the 39 churches in Galveston, 25 were gone. In retrospect, the majority of the victims met their death by either drowning or were killed by flying debris from the wind or waves that turned the flotsam into missiles. Others were crushed by collapsing buildings. But the giant storm did not stop there. To make matters worse, even the cemetery was not safe as the waves washed the coffins of the dead out to sea. Everywhere, the unburied corpses were so thick on the ground, and the manpower so limited, that it was impossible to bury them. Therefore, they tried to load them up on surviving boats and barges and carry them out to sea and dump them. but many of them were just washed back ashore on the incoming tide, complicating the situation. After giving up on this idea, they began building open crematories wherever they found a large group heaped together. To man the pyres, men were drafted at gunpoint and against their will to collect and burn their fellow citizens and neighbors. Clara Barton, who was the founder and president of the American Red Cross, visited Galveston with her team of aid workers. This was to be her last disaster before her retirement in 1904. The funeral pyres resulted in the more effective way to dispose of the thousands of bodies. Galveston authorities were confronted with yet another issue in the midst of everything else they were having to deal with. People were now robbing and mutilating the dead for profit. In all, 50 were found in the act of robbing the dead of jewelry and other valuables. They were immediately gunned down on the spot. There were also 25 that were not found in the act, but were found with evidence to include one with 23 human fingers still adorned with valuable rings. Since the fingers were so bloated, they just cut them off and would remove the jewelry later. These were given a quick trial where they were arrested and then summarily executed. Just before the storm struck, the SS Pensacola, a 1,069-ton steel steamer, under the command of Captain Simmons, set sail and was feared lost. However, the ship survived and returned to Galveston in October 1900. Except for the immense loss of life, this story is not unique, but our hometown of Pensacola has and will encounter another such storm of its own sometime in the future.